This is Corrupt, and I'm Charlie Cruz. Today, how a group of thieves drained 3,000 tons of maple syrup from a government reserve over roughly a year by refilling every barrel with water and letting the scales say nothing was wrong. The barrel weighs exactly what it should. The inspector checks it off the list, moves to the next one. Everything is in order. Barrel count, correct. Weight checks, correct. Inventory, intact. Except it isn't. Somewhere in that warehouse in Saint Louis de Blandford, Quebec, roughly 3,000 tons of maple syrup have already become water. This is how a group of thieves stole approximately 18 million Canadian dollars worth of a government-managed commodity reserve, not by breaking in, but by being there already, and how they got away with it for somewhere between 1 and 2 years before a single open barrel brought the whole thing down. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, the FPAQ, controls maple syrup in Quebec the way a central bank controls currency. Production quotas, export licenses, pricing. If you produce maple syrup in Quebec and you want to sell it, you go through the FPAQ. Full stop. Part of that system is a strategic reserve, a physical stockpile of tens of thousands of barrels held at a rented warehouse facility designed to stabilize global maple syrup prices by releasing supply when a bad harvest creates a shortage. The reserve is a buffer stock in the strictest economic sense, and like any buffer stock, it requires large quantities of product to sit in one location for extended periods. The FPAQ managed that product through weight checks and barrel counts, not chemical testing, not quality sampling on a rolling basis, weight and count. That detail is the whole story. The warehouse at Saint Louis de Blandford was a private facility, operated by a third party on behalf of the FPAQ. The individuals who carried out the theft had legitimate or semi-legitimate access to that facility. The precise nature of that access, whether through employment, a business arrangement, or some combination, is not fully resolved in the public record. What is established is that they were not outsiders who forced entry. They moved among the barrels as people who were supposed to be there. Here's how it worked. A barrel of maple syrup weighs roughly the same as a barrel of water. Syrup is denser, but the difference is not dramatic enough to register as significant through routine spot checks when you are moving through a warehouse of thousands of barrels with a clipboard. The thieves emptied the syrup from barrels and replaced it with water or a lower grade substitute, maintaining the correct weight so that every check the FPAQ system ran would return a clean result. The dominant account from investigators and court proceedings is that the refilling happened on site, though the exact logistics of how the syrup was moved out without detection remains somewhat murky in public reporting. What is clear is that the stolen syrup did not go into storage somewhere. It went into the market. Richard Valieres, identified in court as the central organizer of the operation, had a background in the maple syrup trade. He knew how syrup moved. The stolen product was sold through legitimate broker and resale channels, laundered into the ordinary commercial flow of the industry, not hoarded in a barn. By the time anyone noticed a problem, the syrup was gone twice, once from the barrels and again into a supply chain that had already digested it. You've seen this one before. Stay with me. The operation ran for somewhere between 1 and 2 years. Thousands of barrels, either fully or partially emptied. The total volume is estimated at between 2,700 and 3,000 metric tons, worth somewhere between 17 and 18 million Canadian dollars, depending on the source. All of it sitting behind a security architecture that was, at its foundation, a weight check. The FPAQ's reserve was built for price regulation, not physical security. The audit system assumed that if a barrel weighed correctly and was present and accounted for, the barrel contained what it was supposed to contain. That assumption is reasonable for a price stabilization mechanism. It is a vulnerability for a slow bleed substitution scheme. The thieves did not beat a sophisticated security system. They walked through the gap between two different definitions of the word inventory. The break came from a routine physical audit, not a tip, not a financial irregularity, not a disgruntled co-conspirator, a scheduled FPAQ inspection of the Saint Louis de Blandford warehouse, the kind of check the system ran regularly. The weights were correct. The barrel count was correct. And then an inspector opened a barrel. Water. Once investigators knew what they were looking for, the scale of the operation became calculable. They could trace access records, movement logs, which barrels had been touched and when. The very gap the thieves had exploited, the reliance on weight rather than content, is also what made the discovery moment so clean. Everything had looked right on paper for over a year. one open barrel collapsed the entire picture in an afternoon. Investigators worked through the chain from warehouse to market, identifying the individuals who had moved the syrup, the people who had handled distribution and resale, and the central organizer who had built the network and directed the operation. More than 24 individuals were ultimately charged in connection with the theft and the subsequent sale of the stolen product. Not all downstream buyers faced charges. The question of who knew and who simply bought syrup through normal channels was contested in proceedings. Richard Valliers was convicted. He received the longest sentence among those charged, a substantial prison term alongside a restitution order. He appealed his conviction. The final outcome of that process is not consistently reported across sources, so it sits in that category of unresolved legal detail. The FPAQ reviewed its storage and audit protocols after the theft. The specifics of those changes are not on the public record. The stolen syrup itself was largely unrecoverable as a physical commodity. It had been sold. The financial losses were pursued through the courts. The thing about a buffer stock is that it is only as secure as the assumptions behind the audit system. And the assumption the FPAQ made was that a barrel present and weighing correctly was a barrel of syrup. That assumption held for decades. It only needed to be wrong once, for someone who understood both the storage architecture and the market well enough to move 3,000 tons of maple syrup through normal commercial channels without leaving a visible trace. The barrel weighed exactly what it should. That was the whole trick. You have been listening to Corrupt with Charlie Cruz. Catch you next time.
Grab news. Thomas.